Okay, now we're going to do one about Serapis and its connections. And I'm going to show you a disconnect of reality versus what's even taught, even in a modern day, about this and whenever it starts to form about as a religious point. Okay, and it's talked about as being and coming prominent in the Ptolemaic dynasties, and in most situations say it invented at that point. We will show that that's a little different to it, for I've shown videos before where this connects to a lot of religions, like the point of Dionysus and to the worship of Python and the ancient temple of Apollo and a few other places and temples that actually predate that point. So it doesn't make any sense that the narrative gets pushed, but let's try to dig through that as we see a lot more symbology and what people have said about this. Now, looking at this picture, the first thing you'd notice is that it definitely has a little bit of a Jesus look to it. And if you thought about it, if you were to shave it, it would look a lot like the Statue of Liberty. It has that symbol on top of it, and a lot of people have correlated to Cybele or Tanit and the goddess and the light bringer, which would connect it to Lucifer in some weird ways, but that there would be a candle or incense perhaps put in that, or a cuppet that would hold a certain amount of grain. And so it starts connecting all types of gods to the same type of rebirth and renewal that's seen from Osiris in Egypt, but also in every Proto-Indo-European cult that we can find across through India, all the way to Ireland and all the people in between. Also, you can notice that this is a zodiac disc here, and it's surrounded by a snake, but it's not totally encompassing it. For quite often, it's totally encompassing it, and the snake is biting his own tail, and there's symbology to that I've talked about, or he goes all the way around it. In other depictions of something that looks exactly like this, you see an omphalos or an egg, and he's wrapped up with a snake. Or you'll see a person looking like this man here, who's also wrapped up with a snake, like the snake on the top of the caduceus, right? And that has connotations to, I guess, the Bible, where they talk about brazen serpents and so on. But let's get off into this a little more. What we're looking at here, too, as far as the zodiac goes, is processions of time. And amazingly, or oddly, for some reason, the date that's pinpointed above his head seems to be a date that's about 2,000 years from now. For if we look two back, that's at Aquarius, and right now we have just come out of Pisces, and so we're about my point, or just barely into the age of Aquarius. In fact, when I was a kid, there was the hippie song, "It's the dawning of the age of Aquarius," fifth dimension. Does anybody remember that? It's weird too. It talks about alignments of planets and all these weird things that are going to happen, and just kind of sung out as a ding dong dong. And there's I've done a whole video about that, but let's look into this further. Well, so let's give some type of declamation here, just some knowledge here, for this is a Jesus type character and a resurrecting God like Osiris and everything, and it has to do with sacred bull worship and sacrificing of cows like in the Bible and so on. And boy, there's a lot to this, but whenever you look at Pisces, this is the age of Jesus, and it went for about 2,000 years, and now we're in Aquarius, and Jesus is a fisher of men and so on. It has to do with fish and multiplying fish at a wedding and all these things and iconography that are shown there. If we look at the age before this, there's a declamation actually pretty much at the point here where, going from bull worship, they started sacrificing goats and sheep and things along that nature, and you can see the change of it. But then previously to that point, there is the twins of Gemini and how these people had separated. Although in the Noah story, it gives you a three-type separation, showing you three different people, because there's one that's kind of not talked about so much. But they're all three of these Caucasian primordial civilizations that spread out from there, and that is up near the Caucasus Mountains even, ironically. But man, I could sit and go an hour on this picture, but I don't want to anymore. Let's get into what they say. Serapis, god of fertility and the afterlife that united Greeks and Egyptians. See if I can get in just a hair more on this. Does that look a little better? that should fit well. So it unites the Greeks and Egyptians. Serapis, also called Serapis, was a deity invented by the Ptolemies and was meant to bridge the gap between their Egyptian and Greek subjects. The Ptolemies were one of the successors of Alexander the Great. Well, it's actually what he had put into place, and of course it seems like they poisoned him, and then the generals took over and everything. Maybe it tells you a tale that maybe you shouldn't push your troops farther than what you had originally said, but he was trying to capture the known world in the area that the Persians had, all of the ancient Aryan lands of that area and so on, and pretty much stopped at that point. But then after that, that's whenever the event happened, and this follows after this, and the Seleucid dynasties and so on like that. So let's look into this more. The Ptolemies were one of the successors of Alexander the Great and ruler over Egypt until he was conquered by the Romans in 30 BC. And that's an odd connection with timing, too. And then what led out of that has other connections. And while this was still picked up, but in a different way, almost thrown away, but then secreted, more like covered up and pulled back as a different type of religion, or a new type of religion in the area. It leads to Jesus and things. And think about that as I talk about this. As the Ptolemies was a foreign dynasty somewhat, and even though Alexander was seen as a savior whenever he came in and welcomed into Egypt and a lot of the places that he went, for he was freeing them back up. They had both Greek and Egyptian subjects, though, because they're owning Greece. And in fact, they even pulled down into there in the Ptolemaic dynasties, led through Cleopatra and so on. So they needed to take measures to solidify their rule somehow. And one of these was the invention of the Greco-Egyptian deity Serapis. And we all know about the story in the Bibles where Caesar wanted to put up his statue and they weren't going to have it, and it caused a revolt. Things like that happened and so on. But there's another story that goes along with this, and this again is that typology of echoing, where there was something that happened also during the Hyksos reign that actually does equate quite well, or as close as it can be, for anybody to the actual Exodus of the Bible, but that's another story. So looking at names as simple as this, you can actually maybe see a difference, and using even ancient Celtic or Irish words, meaning like o'clock, like of the clock, and of the clan of, and so on, putting an O in front of it, we can kind of get a little connection etymologically to the naming, and how, well, the Greeks and the Romans both kind of had puns in their names somehow, and how that its name also meant something. But we can see that all the way through in Sumeria and all these other places, and it had a name for it, especially whenever they used the hieroglyphs, and even some of the pictures going together could give you an essence of another step of knowledge about somebody. So Serapis and Osiris appealing to the Egyptians. The man responsible for the creation of Serapis was led to believe Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's most capable generals and the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The name of this god is said to have been the fusion of the Egyptian deity Osiris and the sacred bull Apis, if we remember. Prior to the coming of the Ptolemies, the cults of these two deities had already merged and combined a god. Serapis, already emerged, was worshipped by the Egyptians. Serapis may be said to have represented the essence of an Egyptian religion at the time, and they indeed, just like the Greeks, have over-enveloping aspects. But they have a lot of animism that's connected, and the Greeks try to take animism out of it, and you don't see them with so much animal heads, although they do make references, right? So there's a difference here, and I've told you that what I really love about studying the ancient Sumerians and especially the Egyptians is showing the last of animism that's coming out. And if we look before that, there's a lot of these. And the one thing that's left that we still retain to this day, clutching onto it, is this idea of bird worship and how it goes with the afterlife too, and Horus and so on, and that we still have angels and that you can get your wings and all of these situations. Yeah, when I was a kid, there was Aerosmith Get Your Wings album and stuff, and they had that winged sun disk symbol that they had that looked a lot like it. And of course, Journey, the album cover, is a winged sun disk, and that looked like Mithra and everything. And it just kept getting deeper and deeper and was in my face constantly, especially during this metal rock age and so on. But let's continue. Serapis may have be said to have represented the essence of Egyptian religion at the time. Thus, by using these deities as a core of Serapis, the Egyptian subjects of Ptolemaic Egypt could easily identify familiar with elements in the new deity. But when we look at what was chosen for it, it really has the same connotations. There are leadings of Chronos, Saturn in the idea. There are El, the god of Levant, in the idea. Baal, the storm god, in the idea. Zeus, which is the same type of entity, and it's just a correlation, just a combination. But just because the statue looks a little more Greek doesn't change necessarily the entity altogether. And some depictions show him like this, whereas instead of having the eagle of Horus over the back of his head, that he would have a bull, like the Apis bull. Now, if you look at this statue head on, it's going to not show a bull in any way, and it's going to look like he is horned all of a sudden. And there goes that Satan-y kind of look and everything. But hey, if we peek through around the back of it, that doesn't have anything to do with it. And it has to do with this Apis bull and this sacred bull, which is actually kind of a Jesus iconography run through in a rebirth situation. And also in the Bible can be seen as putting all the sins of the people on this one and then sacrificing him, right? Almost a New Year's resolution type of situation. But Jesus does the same thing for the sins of all mankind, and you're born supposedly with this sin, but he takes that away from you for merely believing in him. And this idea that they really wanted people to believe in this Serapis and Osiris, and it gets echoed all the way in through into our Bible. I could go real deep right now, but I won't. Serapis gains Greek attributes. In order to appeal to the Greek subjects, a number of Greek deities were added to this Egyptian core. These deities included Zeus, which is a storm god, Helios, which is a sun god, Dionysus, which is a rebirthing type of god and of the seasons, like the rites of spring, which has to do with Jesus too, and also the death of winter and being reborn, and Christmas and the whole 9 yards. So Hades, and the god of death and the afterlife, who apparently is going to there. Jesus is supposed to be there too, right? And Asclepius, which seems to be this super knowledgeable, almost a Thoth type thing too, a Mercury, Hermes idea. And so we get a lot of connections off this one unification. But let's go on. By doing so, the attributes of these deities were also added to Serapis. For instance, Serapis gained divine majesty from association with Zeus and became associated with the sun through Helios. But we can see that aspect of Ra and all these things that go on in their pantheon, and we can see the same thing here in Sol Invictus and ideas of Mithra and so on, and how that looks very much familiar to that concept too. And I guess one way to defute the idea that Serapis is some way a brand new person is just looking at this other link that I can click to next, which I will and look over and might do one about it. But it tells you 4,000-year-old relief carvings and decorated stone blocks discovered in Temple of Serapis in Egypt. And it should be in the centralized area of Egypt and stuff, but well, if it's 4,000 years old, that's 2000 BC. That's not in the Ptolemaic dynasty. Invented what? Well, it's more of a pulling together of a pantheonic idea, and if you look at it, with all of that together as one, that's almost a Jesus character. That's almost monotheistic type things. And then, of course, that disappears in a hush hush, and then boom, somebody shows up that re-emulates this Serapis character quite well. He puts together a Buddhist philosophical type thing along with it. Okay, so the attributes that were primary to the nature of this new deity, however, were fertility and or rebirth, like Osiris, and the afterlife, right? These were given to Serapis by adding Dionysus and Hades, respectively. So we can see the rebirth situation in Dionysus, and of course that is Dios of Nisus. That's where that comes from. Greek gods are not necessarily all Greek gods in the first place, but then are other people's gods from only their coming up with things either, whenever you can make all these connections? And the answer is no. And so it's easy for them to make connections like this. Just like you can do Greco-Roman, you can do a lot of other ones. And you can see generational forms of things too. Now, incidentally, the aspects of fertility in the afterlife have long been associated with the Egyptian deity Osiris as well. So now we can see the definite connection on it. And if you look at this, and then the kernel that's on top of it, and how it has wheat or plants that are on it, but in between are berryish type of things, or buds, or fruiting, or something that look like olive branches, right? Then you can see something that looks like this, and you can tell that's a very Greek form. Almost looks like Poseidon, Neptune. And oddly enough, he was found in the sunken city of Alexandria, right there in the port that was there, among other many statues that they have found there. That's from 12-foot tall statue found off the coast of Alexandria. Yep. Serapis is strong Hellenistic elements. So let's go with this Macedonian Hellenistic. So although both Egyptian and Greek deities were used to create Serapis, the deity's final form was predominantly Greek. This can be seen through the iconography of Serapis, or his look, which was full of Hellenistic elements. Well, no crap, the incredible stonemasons making even better statues than these only sideways looking walk like an Egyptian guys after it were the Greeks. And they would show people not in just one pose, but in motion and things. So it showed another level, definitely. For the start, Serapis was an anthropomorphic deity, or man-like. Unlike the gods of the Egyptian pantheon, were often portrayed as zoomorphic, or animistic beings. Additionally, Serapis was depicted as a man wearing a Greek-style robe with a Greek hairstyle and a full beard. It kind of looked like Jesus. Incidentally, Egyptian gods were usually not represented as having full beards. The god Bes is one exception, but then again, the king is always shown with a sacred beard. And only the knowledgeable Greeks and philosophers and gods were shown as this way, for everybody else kept themselves shaved. In fact, that's one of the definitions of barbarians, is just people who wouldn't shave. And if we understand that went through a modern day into barbers, and now barbers are hair cutters, but they also used to do the work of a healer and so on, and bleed people and everything up into a modern day, right? So we can see some connections to this idea too, and then again some olive type structure. And so you can see that full beard, but you can also see again a Jesus type iconography that's there. Interestingly, they found that a bunch of these statues still in some of the crevices held just a little bit of paint to them, and then they know that they were all painted back in the day. And I don't know about you, but like the original picture and something black and white or a sketch sometimes is more intuitive than even seeing something with colored. But if you're looking at colored hair, Egyptian blue eyes, all these type of things, it might give some truth that people didn't know. Also the beard being forked in two, and that being a description of these ancient Caucasians, and it shows you some revelation too. But also the curlets and the ringlets are very much like ringlets that were used before Akkadians and Sumerians and so on. On top of Serapis' head is a basket, or a tall, dry corn measure. So this might have to do with Cybele or so on. called a modius by modern scholars. This was meant to symbolize his fertility attributes and also show his association with Osiris. And Osiris is shown with this grain situation, so this can hook up and measures and so on. And man, you can start making all kinds of connections with this guy. But occasionally Serapis may be portrayed as having a pair of curved ram's horns, and in the time of Aries and after bulls you would see that. But other depictions like we just showed shows bulls and so on too. But there are depictions even on coins with this curl right on their head, along with others that they're trying to deify. And so they make these connections, and people are supposed to make these connections. And in a modern day, all this is but falling apart on trying to make that connection in any way. There's also instances where he is the guardian of the underworld. The three-headed dog, Serapis, is placed at his feet. This is one of them, but interestingly, you can barely make it out with the sketch that's done here, but it's a bunch of bulls facing away and so on. And this looks like the pit of water that's supposed to have been out in front of the ancient temples, which is held up in a giant pot of water that's on the back of bulls and so on, right? Also, interestingly, he has a trident type thing, but it's only a bident, if you will. But some people have said that some of these statues would have had a cowling with a blade put on it that goes up, and they could have been a trident that also. And then you see this trident bident thing with Plato and Hades, and this idea that in Poseidon, Neptune, and the trident, and the god Shiva has it again, and now everything and what they connect to. And it shows you this Proto-Indo-European thing got nurtured and carried through a lot more than what would have happened just naturally. So here's that three-headed dog, Serapis of Hades, and I've done D&D things where we had to do all this and go through the 9 levels of hell to try to get somebody back out of the dead after he ended up dying in one of our campaigns. It was an easy way to waste a few weekends in trying to get somebody back that just died and set up for another event for what came out of that. So you could end up in a different place, you know. Just kind of a vehicle. The rise and fall of a cult that crossed Egyptian borders. The cult of Serapis, and if you look at that, we have Sarah, like Sarah of the Bible. We have Apis, like the Apis bull. We have Osiris, Serapis, and it all starts to make a linguistic connection. Cult of Serapis was a huge success for the Ptolemaic dynasty, and various temples were built in Egypt for his worship. The main temple was in the Ptolemaic capital, Alexandria, and that's where it got submerged and ruined. But according to geographer Strabo, the Serapeum in Alexandria stood in the west of the city. Although it was an important site throughout the Mediterranean, it was almost abandoned on account of the construction of the new buildings at Nicopolis by the time Strabo wrote his geography. Right? Nevertheless, the building existed until 389 AD, when it was destroyed by order of the Emperor Theodosius. And I could go off for a while on that, but here's even one papyrus that has him on there, and he's standing on top of a depiction of a temple and stuff, almost in the position that Horus would be on top of the ancient depictions of the earliest, epigraphs, even before cartouches necessarily. But that's Pope Theophilus standing on top of the Serapeum. Now Theo and Theos has to do with religion. Philus is love, and so he had a love of religion, showing the Christian conquest over the ancient cult in the 5th century. So much after the fact. Strabo also mentions other temples to Serapis in Egypt. For instance, the Serapeum in Canopus is recorded to be renowned for curing the sick, and this is even a thing that's enveloped into the Bible, and I talk about it in one of my other ones that's about the healing powers of Jesus and so on, and how this, just being in the presence and other people worshiping at that temple for the people to be healed, has a healing power in its own and the belief in it. He says it contains the temple of Serapis, which is honored with great reverence and effects such cures that even the most reputable men believe in it and sleep in it themselves on their own behalf, or others for them. And that's a weird way of saying just what I kind of said there. Egyptologists discover unusual structure with possible early depiction of Jesus. Oh no, gonna have to check that up. Destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria. Oh no. Are biblical stories just retelling of ancient mythological accounts? Oh no. Another Serapeum is recorded by Strabo to be found in the city of Memphis, so it's down closer to the Delta. Nonetheless, the cult of Serapis, though created by the Ptolemies for a specific Greco-Egyptian context, gained some popularity beyond the borders of Egypt as well. This is evident in a number of temples dedicated to Serapis, and that may have been found in Italy and Turkey. And so it bends out a little bit. Oh wait, it goes farther. There's also evidence that Serapis made its way into the Roman Britain. A foundation stone for a temple of Serapis was found in 1770 in Yorkshire. The stone names a legate of the 6th century Roman legion, Claudius Hieromanius. And now we can see a connection actually to Horus and stuff, and then, like hieroglyphics right there too. And I could go off on Emperor Claudius and everything and how that works, but he's one of the builders. An archaeologist working in Hampshire in 2017 found that Serapis was found to be one of the 3 gods, the triad, who had temples dedicated to them at the site by the cruel Roman Emperor Nero. So we can see that pushed on people, and of course Nero fiddled while the world died and everything. But Rome didn't really. It just changed. Let's go on though. Nero probably had the temple built to impress the power of Rome upon the people his army had conquered. The god Serapis was for a time not only appealing to the original audience, but to others as well. And now this was probably more just like it was in Egypt, where it was a connective to those people too. So it was showing you, yeah, we got this guy and he's just like your guy, and here's the little connective and this triad thing we got going on, and all the things that connect with these do a lot to that, just like Greco-Roman did, just like Greco-Egyptian does somewhat. And here we go with connectives. Here's a site of the ancient Serapeum, and it almost looks like a Mithraeum type of thing, and a statuary that used to be out in front of it and things, and some of this is still sitting there in a basin, just sitting there. So pretty neat. And you see this connection here, and this look that's very Zeus, and this look that's very Poseidon and very Hades, and the god of the afterlife and resurrection and so on. And if I said that we're talking about Jesus drawn by the Greeks at the first, you might agree with me. And if I showed a picture of this statue facing from the front and said they were evil and Satan, you'd probably, if you're an idiot, you'd believe me. And if I told you that it all hooked up to zodiacal forms, just like Hercules and all these other tellings of before, and it even hooks up to ancient Sumerian beliefs and the zodiac, and as above, so below, and all these people that are commonalities, and it even shows you right directly in front of it, but all you have to do is pick it up and put the pieces back together. And so that's what I try to help y'all do, as well as myself, over and over again, reiterating this fact of these connections to these ancient people here. And darn it, whenever I was looking at this picture before I started the video, I had something I was going to say to end it with, and I can't remember. And it's something that's kind of deep and needs to be said rather than typed. And that ticks me off. So you see fleur-de-lis out the end of this idea of flowers, the concept, the sun coming up over the top of it, or a peacock's feathers, and so on, hooked up to it, and this idea of rebirth and phoenix, and a statue, and Osiris. And so we might see that Serapis and its connections to Sarah and the Apis bull that was sacrificed to take away man's sins, and this person that looked like this that got sacrificed, connected to people deifying a Caesar's dynasty, and then later this book that we know of in Jesus Christ was doing it again for the Flavian dynasty that came after that, and then afterwards kind of stayed stuck in that state as it disappeared behind many veils. Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. We'll go on to more subjects in this, but hopefully I've made a lot of connections. There are some older videos that I've done as much as 3 years ago that make these same type of connections from other viewpoints, like a spider making connections in a web and hooking it to it. And you can see so many connections to all these beliefs in local societies around there and who they connect to. And it shows you a common belief system, which wasn't too far deviated whenever they try to make these connections. Easily seen, almost as easily done. Comment down there in the bottom, hit that bell if you haven't here lately, and make sure that it's on. Get your notifications, guys, because that seems to be failing too. Peace.